I have another stove I want to share with you. This time it's what's been referred to as the Chinese firebox. If you're interested in hearing more about this stove, keep watching. Okay, before we begin, I just want to take a moment to explain why I'm in my backyard rather than in the woods filming this video. That's where, of course, I'd much sooner be. Well, Nova Scotia, like most of the world, is now in a state of emergency as a result of the pandemic. And all the wilderness areas, all the parks, all the trails, both in the municipalities and across the province, have all been closed to public travel. So while I would sooner be in the woods, and the woods would be a good, safe place to be, I can't go right now. So I have to resign myself to doing videos that I can do at home. And I'll save up a number of videos for when the woods are open again and we can get out and share that together. Okay, now the backstory on this stove is, this was loaned to me by a friend of mine, Wayne from Kajika Life, and I'll put a link to Wayne's channel up here in the corner because Wayne has a great YouTube channel, not a big channel, but a growing channel. He's busy right now these days with work, so he doesn't get out to make as many videos as he would like to, but I'm sure at some point he will get back out into the woods, and I think you'll appreciate his content. So Wayne and I met up for coffee some time ago, and he loaned me the stove. He said, let me know what you think of this, maybe if you'd like to do a video of it. So it's not my stove, I didn't pay for it, but it wasn't given to me as a gift, so I owe nobody anything for this stove. Okay, I am going to set the stove up here in my backyard so that you can see the stove. We'll talk about it and we'll get a fire going in it. Okay, here's what the stove looks like when you receive it from China. So this stove is available on eBay, on Amazon, on AliExpress. I'll provide a few links in the show notes below. They sometimes will come branded with either PS Cook or Lixada, but most of the time I believe they come unbranded. So let's open this up and assemble it. I'll give you a few dimensions of it and a few observations before we get to building a fire in it. So as you can see, it's quite a bulky stove. I didn't measure this thickness, but I'm going to estimate it. I will measure it and put it in the show notes, but I'm going to estimate that at an inch, maybe an inch and a half through here, so it's quite bulky in this direction. Setup is fairly simple. There is a few tricks to it, such as make sure you take out the top grate and the ash pan, which dropped down inside on me. Here we go. Take that out. It folds open. There is a grate inside. Hopefully you can see that dropping down, and that's your fire grate the wood will sit on. The ash pan comes in from the side, either side. It doesn't require one side or the other. It's not fitted in very tight, but it will sit in there quite well. And this little grate will sit on top and when you build a fire. Okay, that's the basic assembly of the stove. One other feature that is unique, well, a couple of other features. One is that's quite unique on this one is the feed port. So there is actually a hinged door with a little kind of a lock for a feed port that you can open up and feed quite long sticks in. There are two handles on either side. They're a little finicky to get into play, but for the best of my estimation, these handles can be used to move the stove when it is burning. However, having said that, I'm not sure I'd want to do that with my hands that close to the stove. You may get away with it with leather gloves. I haven't tried it. I think probably I would use a couple of sticks with notches in them to grab the stove if I had to move it. I will say this right now though, if you think that at some point during the burn you're going to have to move the stove, make sure that these are extended prior, because if they're down inside, and they will slide down, like as you can see like that, I doubt, unless you're using a pair of pliers, well, you can see how finicky they are. They actually will come out of their spot. Not my favorite feature of the stove. In fact, if this were my stove, I'd likely remove them altogether because I think they get in the way more than anything else. All right, let's look at a couple of dimensions on this stove, and then I'm going to show you some comparisons because I think it's important to show you where I think the design originated. So the overall height, ground to top, is 8 1/4 inches, and I'll be putting all these measurements with their metric comparisons in the show notes as well. So 8 1/4 to the top. It is 5 1/2 inches wide. It is square, so it is quite a wide, big stove. It is also 5 1/4 inches deep in the burn chamber down to where the grate is. It weighs 1 pound, 13 ounces. All right, this is quite a big stove, but those numbers don't mean a lot unless I give you something to compare them against. So let's bring over my firebox stove. So here's my well-loved, well-used firebox stove, and if you look at them side by side, they're close, but not quite that close. The firebox is a little bit smaller all the way around in size, and it's also heavier. I just have to reach over for my notes, but I believe, yes, the firebox is 2 pounds, 2 ounces. So it's half again, almost a third or 2/3 again is heavy, not quite twice as heavy, but it's considerably heavier than this stove is, the Chinese stove. I think where people often refer to this as the Chinese firebox is because of the fact that it is a folding stove and it has a removable ash plate like the firebox does. If I can get that back in place. And it has a drop-down fire grate for the wood to sit on. So it does have those things in common. However, when I looked at this, I thought it had more in common with a different stove, not the firebox, and that is the Bushbox from Germany. Now this is the LF model, so it is the smaller model. As you know, there's an XL version of the firebox or the Bushbox that is approximately the same size as the firebox. But the reason I'm showing you this is the only one of the Bushbox series that I own at this time. So the reason I'm showing you this is because I think there's more inspiration comes from this stove than does from the firebox. So the way that the Bushbox works, it's also a folding stove. And it folds inwards on the sides and collapses down. So that when you open it up, inside you have a ash plate that drops down and a fire grate that drops down. So you can see the two of them inside of there. The feed port is raised. It's a little bit different than it is on the firebox, of course. And that's what, I'll have to take the ash pan out. This Chinese one has that same similarity in design in that the sides fold inwards as it collapses up. So I think the inspiration again is more closely related to the Bushbox than it is the firebox. Having said that, it doesn't have a name. What are you going to call it? Well, I guess you could call it the Chinese firebox. You could call it the Chinese Bushbox. How about the Chinese Bushfire? I'm not suggesting that. I'm just trying to come up with a name for it. Okay, so there's the basic design of the stove. It does have some quirks when you go to use it that I want to share with you as I load it with wood. And a few things that if this was my stove, I think I would do to modify it to make it work even better. Actually, one of the things I'm going to show you right now, because it's not something I'm going to be able to do, but if this was my stove, I would do this to it. And that is, this is not going to work with wood pellets, not without a whole lot of modifications. Some type of a big screen in the bottom there, because obviously all your pellets are going to drop down through. So that is one thing that I won't be trying in this stove. But the other thing is, if this was my stove, I would take my Trangia, make some measurements from the Trangia, the height of the stove, and that 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch, and I would drill a series of holes through the sides of this so that I could run skewers through to set a pot on, as long as the pot is smaller in diameter than is the stove itself. If you want to use it with a pot on top of the stove, then that's what a second set of holes and skewers would do, would allow you to raise the Trangia right up to the exact height that you want it to. So yeah, it wouldn't be too difficult to drill some holes in this. The gauge steel is lighter than the firebox by a good margin, but having said that, it's still quite a sturdy stove. I'm not complaining about the sturdiness of it all. One thing I will say right up front before we get going with the fire is that I don't know what to think about this door, because quite often it doesn't take much for it to fall open. I've noticed that, especially when there's wood inside. This is not what you call a snug fit. And not that this is a big deal, but it's also, because it's not a snug fit, I've seen flames shooting up the side here. Not a fire risk, just I guess you might say a waste of heat, because it's not going to come in contact with your pot if it's shooting up there. Getting this open can be a bit of a trick as well. So that's the way it'll sit. If you can keep the ring out, that's great. If not, if the ring lays flat, you're going to need some way of getting a hold of the ring to turn it, because you're not going to do that with your hands. A pair of pliers again, if you have your Leatherman, or another pair of pliers, or a stick with a notch on it, you'll be able to open that up. All right, now I'm going to break away, fill this full of wood, and we'll set up and run a burn on it. I'll show you some of the attributes, some of the quirks with it when it's actually operating. Okay, so I've got the stove preloaded with wood in a vertical stack, and I'm going for a top-down burn. Now, with all that wood, well, it'll be interesting. I'll do a general time. I'm not looking for specific times, but I'll do a general time to see just how long it'll run like that. But I expect that this is going to give me a huge blazing fire. That's been my experience with it. I've used it a few times now in the woods. Had some good experiences with it. So to light this today, yeah, still using some of that commercial fire starter. Find my lighter here. We'll get that lit. I'll put some wood chips on it because, of course, you have to kind of get that going for a bit before it'll really take off. I do have a pot of water that I'll be putting on to show you. It's not a large pot, but it is a 13 centimeter pot because I think this, with a stove this size, you can go up to quite a large pot on it. You know, it's got a good volume, so it should work out with larger pots as well. In fact, it's a bit of an overkill for small pots. Wood chips from carving projects to get the top of the burn going. And I'll probably have to cut away in a second to give this a chance to really get caught up, and then I'll show you some of the interesting things about the stove. There's not a lot of wind here today, but there is a little bit, so I do have a windscreen. Again, I'm not looking for a boil time. I'm just looking to show you the operation of the stove. So what I'll do is, that's starting to catch, is I will turn the camera back on in a few minutes when the wood inside is really well caught, and then we'll talk about how the stove functions. So it's been about 5 minutes since I lit the top of the wood, and the fire is sinking down nicely into the wood. Pretty much all the wood is engaged now. So it'd be at this point, if not sooner, that I would have put the grate on that comes with this so that I can get a pot of water on. So here's the grate that comes with. Now I'm using a pair of pliers because I don't have my leather gloves handy, but this is what comes with, and that sits down kind of just nicely, if you can get it on properly. I probably could have put it on as soon as I lit the stove, would have been a little easier. There we go. Now it's sitting on. So, you know, I really think that this would be a great stove for use with charcoal. So make this a folding charcoal stove. Yeah, I think this would work really well, especially with that grate. You could grill something right on top of that grate. But it is also intended to be a pot stand, and I have my doubts about the long-term durability of it to start with. But more importantly, watch what happens when I put a pot on. Now, the last time I did this, it was a slightly wider diameter pot, but you can see how clean and efficiently the wood is burning right now. But when I put the pot on, you can see smoke, and that's not uncommon for a stove. When you start to cut off some of the airflow at the top, of course it's going to smoke. But with a larger pot, which this stove can easily handle, you can virtually cut off all the oxygen or all the exhaust coming up through. So right now you can see the flames are moving up around the outside of the pot nicely, with some smoke, but not a lot, which is acceptable. But again, with a larger pot, it's a bit of an issue because you're cutting off all the airflow. Now, Wayne, the owner of the stove, my friend Wayne, also recognized this issue. So he came up with a workaround solution that I'll share with you now. Take the pot off. Take the grill off. Again, see how cleanly it's burning right now. By the way, this is going to go through wood incredibly quick with incredibly hot fire. And one of the reasons I believe that's the case is because there's so much airflow coming through that grate. The grate I showed you, the fire grate to hold the wood, in my opinion, the holes in it are just way, way too big. It's allowing too much air to travel through. Not only is it allowing too much air to come up through, it's also allowing too many of the hot coals and ash to fall down underneath. Now, it does have that ash pan, but a cross breeze could drag some of that out through the sides of it. So I don't consider this dangerous because, of course, you are still going to use all the same safety precautions you would with any wood stove or any open fire, but where you set it up. I just think that the grate inside could use smaller holes, maybe even as small as that, or maybe even a little bit smaller. So what did Wayne come up with? Well, he took 2 pieces of steel, metal bars. They are just over ½ inch, or not quite 3/4 of an inch wide. He notched them in on each end with a Dremel tool, and he notched the sides of the stove itself so that he could mate them up. Let's see if I can do this without... Not easily. This folding nature of the sides of this stove make it such that little fiddling sometimes is necessary. All right, I think I've got it on there more or less the way it's intended. I don't think I have it quite right, but I think it'll work well enough for demonstration purposes. So what we've done is we have the stove, or the top bars are raising up, not a whole lot, probably 1/4 inch or so, but let's put this back on. Look how much less smoke is being produced around the outside of the pot. Still some, yes, but a whole lot less. And that's because we have created more area around the base of the pot for the exhaust of smoke and air. So what we have in the design of the stove is a bit of a mismatch between the inflowing air and the outgoing air. Wayne's 2 little pieces of metal are working. If this was my stove, I think I would probably have used that Walmart $1 stainless steel ruler and cut it into sections so that I could have got a little bit more height yet. Not an issue with this pot, again, only at 13 centimeters, but if you're talking about a large pot like the Pathfinder Bush pot, which is 14 centimeters, or the 14 centimeter Zebra pot, it pretty much covers the whole top of the stove, and you get a lot more smoke. So raising it off of the top of the stove makes a huge difference. I think also, like I mentioned, I would put something in the bottom to occlude some of the airflow. Now, one of the things I want to do while this is sitting here, but I got to tell you, this is producing a lot of heat. This would make a nice campfire stove, something that you could sit around and actually warm yourself up with a lot of wood. All that wood, it's still going, no feeding necessary. But when it gets time to feed it, then you can see the fire is just halfway down the wood right now, but you can get in some pretty long sticks. Or if you want to have a less intense fire, start with a much smaller one in the base and then feed it in through the sides here. Close that up. This is a bit tricky. Now, if you didn't bring your pliers with you, your Leatherman or something else, you could still do that if you made a little notch stick, or a stick with a little Y branch on the bottom of it to do that with. You know, somebody commented in one of my other videos that they thought I was too close to the stove in terms of the heat in my camera. Rest assured, I'm about 5 feet above the stove. I just used the telephoto lens to get you a better view inside. That is one raging fire down inside there. There's a lot of heat being produced. Even at this 5 feet distance, I'm still feeling the heat. Not enough to melt plastic or anything, but hot enough to keep me warm. That is a lot of heat coming out of that top of that stove. All right, now I have to wait for this stove to burn through, cool down. I'll give you an idea about how long it ran with that little load of wood, and we'll close up with a few thoughts. All right, well, the stove ran for about 20-25 minutes on that load of wood, which is actually pretty good. It was a big pile of wood, though, so much more than most of the other stoves I have will hold. So, yeah, one of the things I did notice I probably could have taken some video of is I could see down inside the stove as the fire was dying down and burning down into coals, how many of the coals had dropped through that big grate onto the screen below, onto the plate underneath. So it's a very good thing that plate is there, because had they dropped onto a combustible surface, it could have been a real problem. But be that as it may, it does work. I did have ashes blowing out from under it, so if you were exposing the stove to a strong wind from the side, you could lose some of those hot coals out from underneath it. So, as I mentioned before, regular safe fire practices apply to this, as they do to all stoves for that matter. So, a couple thoughts on this. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but it is warping a little bit, but you know, functionally it's not changing anything, and I think that's maybe to the loose tolerances. The reason why it's not going to change the function of the stove. It does warp a little bit like that. Aesthetically, it's not pleasing. It's not as convincing in terms of durability as maybe the firebox stove is. But, you know, as I look at the plates, yes, I can see a little bit of warping, but that whole folding design seems to negate any negative effects that it has on it. So what do I like about it? Well, one thing I like about it right up front, and clearly, is the price. It is not an expensive stove. You can get these for around $25 Canadian, and like I said, I'll put a few links in the show notes below if you want to check them out. I like the fact that it's stainless steel. I like the volume. This is a huge stove. It's not an everyday stove. This may be one you want to carry when there's 2 or even 3 people and you do have to do some volume boiling of water, maybe melting of snow, or maybe using it as a charcoal. I think this would make a great charcoal, almost like a hibachi type of a thing that you could use. Those are probably the things I like most about it. What do I dislike about it? It feels finicky to me. Like, it doesn't feel like it's going to be stable over the long term. I don't see anything deteriorating. I've had 5-6 fires in it. Wayne's had a number of fires in it. So it may not have the long-term durability of a firebox, but still I think it's going to last long enough, especially for that cost. There's a few things I really am not fans of. One of these little handles I think I mentioned that I can only imagine are there for picking the stove up while it's hot. I think I'd get rid of those right away if I bought this for myself. I'm not a real fan of this door. I can see the benefit of the idea of opening up and feeding some long sticks through. Yeah, the door works for that, but I'm not a fan of this lock. I think I would want to fiddle or modify that lock to make sure that it stays closed. As I said, it even did happen. I didn't catch it on camera, but the door, as the wood moved around, as it sank down inside, as it burned, the door flopped open, and that was because it just happened to hit the, I don't know if I can even get it to do it, just kind of hit the catch on side and down it dropped. So maybe some slight bending might be in order here, just to make sure that it sits tight and you actually have to make a concerted effort to open it. I really dislike that large grate inside. I think that it does a couple of things that are negative. One, it allows too many of the hot coals to pass through, and primarily it allows too much hot air, or too much air to enter through the wood, so it's burning it excessively fast, excessively hot. Also, from the design standpoint, I'm not a fan of that little grill that goes on top. Okay, if I'm grilling something over charcoal, but if I want to use this fire for boiling water or frying on top of something like a pan or a pot, I think there has to be some height added to it. So Wayne's idea of adding those 2 little bars is right on the money. I think I would use something a little taller yet, so I can get at least a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch clearance underneath whatever vessel I have on top of it. Okay, I think I've kind of gone through the stove pretty clearly. If you have any questions or any comments on these, you know, please put them in the comments section below. Maybe one comment I will add to this is, you know, this stove and the one from P.S. Cook, the folding one that opens like a book, they seem to have come on the market about the same time, and they seem to be similar in nature. There's a big difference between the two of them. I guess if I was to choose one over the other, if you're kind of saying, I think I'd like to buy an inexpensive stove, which one do I buy? Buy this one. I just think it's closer to a fully functional stove with no modifications necessary. You can do a lot with this. It folds up to about the same size, same weight. So yeah, this one just has a little bit more going for it than the other one does. Even with any of the negatives that I mentioned, I think they're quite easily overcome. Okay, that's everything I'm going to say about this stove. So, I'm in my backyard, and it looks like I will be for the foreseeable future. I do have videos I can do from here, and unless something changes and I can get out in the woods, then I'm going to be doing more videos from home. If you have any comments on that, or any videos you think I could do at home that you might be of interest to all of you, please put those in the comments section below. And rather than my normal closer, I think what I'll say at this time is, please, everybody, stay safe. Follow all the guidelines for hand washing and social distancing. Stay safe. Let's get ahead of this and make sure we don't lose anybody unnecessarily to it. Bye for now.